Talbot's coffee mug landed on the hood of Kane's vehicle hard enough to leave a dent, hot liquid spreading across the metal like a stain. Nobody was going to apologize for. Wrong lot, he said, not looking at her. Support staff parks on the east side. Kane didn't move. She set her gear bag down on the ground, the way you set something down when you intend to pick it up again, deliberately, without hurry, and looked at the vehicle, which was identical to every other vehicle in the lot, and then looked at Talbot. "I'm assigned to Bravo element," she said. Talbot laughed, not at her specifically. Just the idea of it floated out loud, landing somewhere between the trucks. There were 4 other men in the staging area: Corbin, Yates, Drummond, and a heavy-set staff sergeant named Fitch who'd been with the 75th for 11 years, and wore that fact the way some men wear cologne constantly, whether or not the occasion called for it. They didn't laugh. They just stopped what they were doing and watched the way people watch something that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to be interesting or embarrassing. "Bravo element," Talbot repeated. "Sure. Staff Sergeant Talbot." She kept her voice flat. "I have orders. I'm sure you do." He finally looked at her. He was maybe 35, 6'2", with the kind of jaw that suggested he'd been told his whole life that his appearance was an achievement. "I'm sure somebody behind a desk somewhere thought this was a real good idea, but we're not behind a desk. We're standing in front of a 12-day direct action exercise in terrain that chews up guys twice your size, and I've got a team to keep alive. So, East Lot." Kane reached into her jacket and pulled out the folded orders. She didn't hand them to him. She just held them at chest height, visible. Fitch looked at the paper, looked at Talbot, went back to checking his kit. "Sir," said Yates, who was the youngest of them and apparently hadn't learned that neutrality was a survival skill. "She's on the manifest." Talbot took the orders, read them, handed them back. His expression didn't change, which meant it got harder, the way a face gets when someone's made a decision that isn't about logic anymore. "Fine," he said. "Welcome to Bravo. Try to keep up." Her name was Kane, Sergeant First Class Meredith Kane, and she'd been a designated marksman with the 160th. Before a classified operation in a country she wasn't allowed to name had left her with a reputation that existed entirely in documents, marked with access restrictions, and a left shoulder that ached every morning in cold weather, and a very clear set of skills that 3 separate evaluation boards had rated as exceptional. She was 31 years old, 5'6", and had the kind of face that made people in airports assume she was a graduate student. She had learned over many years to treat that assumption as a tactical asset. The exercise was Joint Readiness Training, a 12-day rotation at a facility in Louisiana that existed specifically to remind elite units that there was always something harder than what they'd already done. Bravo Element was a 6-man Ranger assessment team tasked with simulating long-range surveillance and target acquisition. Kane had been assigned as a 7th member to evaluate integration protocols, a phrase that meant, in plain language, that someone further up the chain had decided it was time to see how a female designated marksman performed alongside a Ranger team operating at full tempo. She had not been asked if she wanted to be a test case. She had not been given a choice about the optics of it. She had been given orders, and she had followed them, which was the only relevant fact as far as she was concerned. The first day of the exercise was administrative. Gear inspection, comms checks, map study. Kane set up her workspace at the end of the planning table and was told, without anyone saying it directly, that she was at the end of the planning table because that was where spare space existed, not because she was part of the planning. She listened to everything anyway. Talbot ran the briefing like a man who'd done it 100 times and expected everyone in the room to already know what he was about to say. He moved through the 12-day sequence with a practiced efficiency that Kane recognized as genuinely competent. Whatever else Talbot was, he knew his job. She filed that away the way she filed everything, without judgment, because judgment was a luxury that got people killed. "Observation post rotations," Talbot said, clicking to the final slide. "We're running 4-hour shifts, 2-man teams. Corbin and Yates, Drummond and Fitch." A pause. "Kane, you're with me." She said nothing. Drummond, who had not spoken directly to her at any point, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough. "Something to add, Drummond?" Talbot asked. "No, Sergeant, good." That night in the barracks, Kane lay in her assigned bunk and stared at the ceiling. She'd claimed a bottom rack near the emergency exit because it meant she could see the door and hear anyone coming down the hallway, and because she had been doing that since her second deployment and didn't know how to stop. Habits were just training with the formal structure removed. She was not afraid. Fear was something she dealt with in a concrete way, examined it, understood its mechanics, learned to let it inform her choices without controlling them. What she felt instead was something closer to a very clear awareness that the next 12 days were going to be harder because of what she was than because of what she could do, and that those two things needed to stay entirely separate in her head, or she would start making mistakes. Her mother had been an army nurse. 40 years ago, in a different army in a different world, she'd told Kane once, when Kane was maybe 16 and had announced for the first time that she was going to enlist, that the military would either make her a harder person or a smarter one, and that the best outcome was both. She'd said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. Kane had thought about that conversation at least once a month for the past 15 years. Day 2 started with a 6-mile loaded movement through terrain that was aggressively unkind. Kane had studied the maps the night before and knew the route, knew where the elevation changes would catch people if they'd underestimated the grade, knew where the ground turned soft under tree cover. She moved at Talbot's shoulder and said nothing, and matched his pace exactly. At mile 4, Yates started dropping back. At mile 5, Drummond had a blister situation that was going to affect the rest of the exercise if it wasn't addressed. Kane said nothing about either of these things. She wasn't here to evaluate them. She was here to be evaluated. Talbot watched her move. She felt it the way you feel most things in the field, not directly, but as a kind of atmospheric pressure, a shift in attention. At the end of the movement, he looked at her for a long second. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "Some version of it, the 160th. What'd you do there?" "This and that." His jaw tightened slightly. "You're going to have to be more specific eventually. When it's relevant, I will be." She walked past him toward the water point, and she could feel his silence behind her, which was a different kind of silence than the one she'd been getting since she arrived. It had less contempt in it and more calculation. That was something. Day 3 brought the first live fire evaluation. The range was set up at varying distances, 200 meters, 400, 650, and a single steel target at 900 that the instructors referred to as the bonus, which meant it was technically optional and practically mandatory for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously. Talbot went first. He was excellent. Kane had expected that. His 5-round group at 400 meters was tight enough to cover with a playing card, and his 650 shot was clean. He skipped the bonus, which was a choice, not a failure. The wind at 900 was unpredictable, and a miss was worse optics than not attempting. Corbin, Yates, Drummond, and Fitch all qualified. Corbin and Drummond were particularly solid. These were men who worked. "Kane," the range instructor called. She moved to the line. The wind had shifted in the last 4 minutes. She'd been tracking it, watching the indicators, running the math without paper, because paper took time she might not have. At 200, she placed her first round without drama. 400, same. 650, a half-breath hold to account for the crosswind, clean impact. She chambered around and put her scope on the 900 target. The wind was still inconsistent. She waited. 30 seconds, 45. Behind her, she heard someone shift their weight, the small sound of impatience. She didn't rush. The wind settled. She fired. Steel rang. The range went quiet for a beat that lasted slightly longer than it should have. "Impact confirmed," the instructor said. 900. She cleared her rifle and stepped back from the line. Talbot said nothing. His expression was the particular blankness of someone reorganizing their assumptions, and he wasn't doing it gracefully, but he was doing it, and that was more than she'd expected on day 3. Corbin came up beside her as she was breaking down her gear. He was a compact, quiet man from somewhere in the Carolinas who had said maybe 40 words to her in 3 days, which was roughly 40 words more than Drummond. "Good shooting," he said. "Thank you." He nodded and walked away. That was the whole conversation, and it was the most uncomplicated thing that had happened to her since she'd arrived. That night, she heard Talbot and Drummond talking outside the barracks. Not loudly, not secretly, the kind of conversation men have when they don't think anyone's paying particular attention. Doesn't mean anything. Wind happened to settle. She was waiting for it, Corbin said, and he must have been there too, standing somewhere Kane couldn't see. That's not luck, that's reading conditions. Silence. Doesn't mean she can do what we do in the field? Talbot said. No, Corbin agreed, but it means she can shoot. Kane went back to her bunk and lay down and didn't sleep for another 2 hours. Day 5 was the first genuine field problem. an overnight surveillance evolution that required them to establish a hide site, maintain observation on a simulated objective for 16 hours, and extract without being detected by the opposing force. It was the kind of task that seemed straightforward in the planning room and became something else entirely once you were 3 hours into lying still in Louisiana clay while insects explored your collar. Kane was paired with Talbot for the movement to the hide. Fitch and Yates were taking a parallel route to a secondary position. Corbin and Drummond were on comm support. They moved through the wood line in silence, and she discovered that Talbot, whatever his other qualities, was a skilled field operator. He moved quietly, used terrain well, made good decisions at junctions. She matched him without effort. They didn't need to speak, which was how it was supposed to work. They found the hide site, a natural depression at the base of a ridge, partially concealed by deadfall, and Kane took one look at it and started making modifications without being asked. She saw the angles differently than the map had suggested, saw where the morning light would compromise their position in 4 hours if they stayed oriented the way Talbot had chosen. "Wrong direction," she said quietly. He turned to look at her. Not angry, just flat. "Sunrise comes in from the east-northeast here. We're facing east. By 0600, we've got direct light on the glass. We shift 8 degrees left, use that log as a secondary screen. We're clean until at least 09. He looked at the site, looked at the tree line. Didn't say anything for a moment. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He repositioned without comment, and they rebuilt the hide in 40 minutes. And when 6 in the morning came and the light started angling through the trees, their optics stayed dark, and the opposing force patrol that moved through at 0730 walked 30 meters from their position and kept going. After the patrol cleared, Talbot said, very quietly, "Good call." Kane said, "Thank you, Sergeant." They lay there for another 9 hours. She had gotten very good at being still. It was one of those skills that nobody taught you formally, that you developed through need, through the understanding that movement was cost and silence was currency. She thought about her mother sometimes on long hides, about the way her mother had moved through a hospital ward during Kane's one visit. With that same deliberate efficiency, always knowing where everything was without looking, never wasting motion. There was a version of her mother that might have been very good at this, she thought. Her mother would have found that observation either funny or sad, probably both. Day 6 changed things. Kane discovered it during the morning equipment check. Her rangefinder, the Vectronics she'd signed out from supply and had personally calibrated before the exercise, was registering false reads. Distances that should have been in the 400 to 500 meter range were coming back as 250, 270, consistent errors. Not equipment failure, because equipment failure was random. This was systematic. She checked the unit twice, then checked the battery contacts, then checked the calibration settings, and found that the calibration had been reset. Someone had gone into the unit's menu and changed the reference values. It was not something that happened by accident. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went through her kit more thoroughly. Her data book, the small notebook where she recorded ballistic data, wind readings, shot logs, had pages stuck together in a way that suggested they'd been wet and dried. Not soaked, selectively dampened, just enough to make certain pages illegible. She cataloged the damage, recalibrated the rangefinder from memory, rewrote the critical data from the ruined pages using what she carried in her head, because she had always known that equipment failed and brains didn't, usually. She said nothing to anyone. At the morning brief, Talbot walked them through the day's evolution, a 4-kilometer movement to a new observation post, followed by a 6-hour surveillance block with simulated reporting requirements. Standard. Kane watched Drummond during the brief. He was attentive in the particular way of someone who already knows what's going to happen and is watching to see if the other person has figured it out. She filed that away too. The movement to the new OP was uneventful. Kane ran her own navigation, cross-checking against the team's route, and once caught a bearing error that would have added 40 minutes and taken them through a depression that would have been impassable after last night's rain. She mentioned it to Talbot without framing it as a correction. "The alternate route through the ridgeline is cleaner," she said. "That low ground's going to be soft." He checked his map, checked the terrain, made the call to adjust without announcement, as if he'd been thinking it anyway, which maybe he had. She didn't care either way. They got where they were going. The surveillance block went cleanly until hour 4, When Yates came over the radio with a position report that used the wrong grid reference format, sending the simulated reporting chain to a location a quarter-kilometer off from their actual position. It was the kind of error that in a training environment caused delays and frustration, and in an actual environment caused fires to land on the wrong coordinates. Kane caught it. She pulled up the position data, ran the conversion, identified the discrepancy, and transmitted a correction in the time it took Talbot to realize something was wrong. "Where'd you learn comms protocols?" Talbot asked, not hostilely, just with that quality of specific attention she'd started to recognize. "You pick things up," she said. That evening, Corbin found her at the edge of the staging area, doing her kit check for the following day. He sat down on a log at a respectful distance and didn't open with anything social. "Your rangefinder got messed with," he said. "And before you ask how I know, I saw Drummond near your kit 2 nights ago." "Didn't think much of it then?" Kane continued, checking her gear. "I'm not asking you to make a formal complaint," Corbin said. "I'm just telling you what I saw." "Okay. You're not going to do anything about it?" "I didn't say that." He was quiet for a moment. "Drummond's not a bad operator. He's just got a fixed idea about how things should work and who should be where." "I know the type. Does it bother you?" Kane looked up from her gear. "What bothers me is that I have a job to do and someone is making it harder. The reasons why don't change that." Corbin nodded slowly. He had a way of considering things before responding that she'd noticed from the first day, and she'd come to read it as a quality marker rather than hesitation. "You're going to need allies," he said. "Not charity allies. People who see what's actually happening and are willing to say so. Are you volunteering?" He didn't answer right away. "I've got a daughter," he said. "She's 12, wants to go Army. I keep not knowing what to tell her." He stood up, brushed bark off his pants. "I guess I'm saying, yeah, I'm volunteering." He walked away. Kane held that for a moment and then went back to her kit. Day 7. The exercise was deepening into its final phase and the real work was beginning. 7 days in, fatigue was a variable the instructors were deliberately not accounting for, which meant it was the most important variable. Men who had been performing adequately started making small errors. Navigation shortcuts, comms sloppiness, the creeping tendency to substitute confidence for verification. Kane's errors went in the opposite direction. The longer she went without sleep, the more her attention narrowed until she could hold a position for hours without moving, tracking a single sector, and everything outside that sector stopped existing. It was not a healthy trait, she knew, but it was a useful one. She was in position at the main OP with Talbot when Drummond came over the net with a warning about opposing force movement north of their position. It was wrong. She knew it immediately because she'd been watching the north sector for the past 3 hours and nothing had moved. And because the way Drummond described the movement, patrol element 6 to 8 personnel moving southeast, didn't match the timing or the route she'd been tracking. If 6 to 8 people had been moving southeast in the past hour, she would have seen sign of it. "I don't have eyes on that," she said quietly to Talbot. "Drummond's confident," Talbot said. "Drummond's wrong." He looked at her. "Or," she said carefully, "he's working from information he didn't get from observation. Either way, if we move to cover a northern threat that doesn't exist, we expose our eastern flank to the actual patrol route, which I've been tracking for the past 90 minutes. Talbot was silent. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," she said. "I'm asking you to wait 3 minutes and see." They waited. 90 seconds later, the opposing force element appeared from the east, exactly on the bearing Kane had been watching, and they were close enough that Talbot could see them with his naked eye. Before he raised his optic, he made the call. They held position. The element passed without detecting them. When it cleared, Talbot got on the radio. "Drummond, update your position report. Eastern flank. Be advised your last grid was incorrect." A pause on the net. Then Drummond's voice flat and careful. "Confirm my error." It wasn't a confession. It was a tactical retreat. But Talbot had heard what it was, and Kane had heard what it was, and the difference between an honest mistake and a deliberate one was something you learned to read in the particular quality of the silence after a radio transmission. That night, Talbot found her at the water point. He stood there for a moment like a man who'd rehearsed something and was deciding whether to say it. "You caught the grid error on day 6, he said. "The comms correction. The OP orientation on night 3. And tonight, I was doing my job." "Yeah," he was quiet. "I've been doing this for 11 years, and I came in here with a very specific idea of what this assignment was going to be. A test case, A box somebody upstairs needed to check. He paused. I was wrong about that. Kane said nothing. That's not an apology, he said. But I'm telling you what I actually think, which is that you're a better field operator than two of the men on my team, and I should have been able to see that without needing a week and a half of you proving it. She thought about several things she could say. She said, what changed your mind? East flank, 3 minutes. He looked away toward the tree line. Most people, when they know they're right, they argue, they push. You just said, wait 3 minutes and see. He stopped. That's how somebody thinks who's actually done this. I have, she said. I know. I pulled your file last night. The redacted version, which is most of it, but enough. He looked back at her. I should have done that on day one. Yes, she said. You should have. He absorbed that. Drummond, he said. The rangefinder, you know about that, Corbin told me an hour ago. His jaw was set. I'm going to handle it. That's your call. Does it matter to you how I handle it? She considered the question honestly. It matters that it doesn't happen again. The how is up to you. He nodded once and walked back toward the staging area. The next morning, Drummond was assigned to solo comms duty at the rear element for the remainder of the exercise. No explanation was given, none was necessary. The team understood the geometry of it, and Kane watched Corbin make brief eye contact with her across the staging area and then look away, which was all the acknowledgement the moment needed. The final 4 days of the exercise were the hardest and, in a complicated way, the best. With Drummond removed from the field element, the team compressed into something more functional. Talbot stopped running parallel to her decisions and started incorporating them. Yates, who was genuinely talented and had been deferring to the team's social hierarchy rather than his own judgment, started asking her questions during planning that were worth answering. Fitch, who had barely spoken to her all week, turned out to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the local terrain that he'd been not volunteering until he saw that the team's dynamic had shifted. They operated well together, not seamlessly. 11 days of initial friction didn't evaporate, but well, the kind of well that you recognized, because mistakes started coming from genuine uncertainty rather than sabotage, and that was a problem she knew how to work with. On day 11, they ran the capstone evolution, a simulated high-value target surveillance operation requiring them to maintain a hide for 20 hours, log personnel patterns, and provide targeting data for a simulated strike package. Everything about it was designed to test whether the team could perform under cumulative exhaustion, and without the artificial structure of daily graded events. They performed. Kane ran the observation for 11 of the 20 hours, splitting time with Corbin when her concentration finally started to compress, and in that time she logged 47 personnel movements, 2 vehicle rotations. One pattern anomaly that the instructors later confirmed was a planned diversion, and which she'd flagged as a diversion in her reports at hour 7. The debrief the following morning was conducted by the battalion's senior observer controller, a full colonel named Stearns, who had the flat, precise diction of someone who had been doing evaluations long enough that surprise was no longer an available reaction. He went through the team's performance data point by point. He was thorough and fair, and he called mistakes, and strengths. And when he reached Kane's data, he paused for a moment. Sergeant Kane, he said, the diversion flag at hour 7. Walk me through your read. She walked him through it, the slight variance in timing intervals, the way the second vehicle's route overlapped with the first in a way that served no tactical logic unless the purpose was to draw attention to a sector. The pattern break that happened approximately 40 minutes before she flagged it, which was the actual tell, the real anomaly, and which she'd needed the 40 minutes to cross-reference before she was confident enough to put it in the report. Stearns listened without interrupting. Your assessment of the diversion was correct, he said. And in a live environment, the targeting package you'd have protected with that flag would have been the right one. The other package would have been the diversion. A pause. Good work, she said. Thank you, sir. Talbot was across the room and she didn't look at him, but she heard him exhale. After the debrief, Stearns found her outside. He was a deliberate man, not given to small talk. He looked at her for a moment like he was making a decision about something. I knew your mother, he said. She went still. Mary Frances Kane, 28th CSH. We served 3 rotations together in different capacities. She was the best trauma nurse I worked with. A beat. She talked about you, about the kid who was going to enlist, and there was no stopping her. Kane's throat had gone complicated. She would have been. He stopped. He was not a sentimental man, and he was navigating around the edges of something that didn't fit neatly into his vocabulary. She would have understood what this week cost you, and she would have known you could pay it. He handed her a piece of paper. Not orders, a transfer request form, blank, ready to be filled out. This is not pressure, he said. I'm offering you an out if you want one. Some people, after an exercise like this, decide the integration program is someone else's battle. I'd understand that. Kane took the paper, looked at it, for a long moment. She thought about Corbin's daughter, about Yates, who by the end of day 10 had been asking her questions that a younger version of herself would have asked someone with her background, and who deserved to keep asking them. About the next woman who would be assigned to this exercise, or one like it, and what she would walk into. She tore the form in half. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Stearns looked at the two halves of the form. Your mother, he said, would have done the exact same thing. Something shifted in his expression, brief and controlled. Finish this program, Kane. Build the record. Because there are people in positions above mine who are watching this exercise and looking for reasons. Give them results instead. She came back to the barracks that last night and found her bunk exactly as she'd left it. The team was finishing the final admin before morning stand-down. Quiet in the way of people who are tired and done and have processed most of what needed processing. Corbin was cleaning his rifle at the table. He looked up when she came in. Stearns talked to you, he asked. Yes, you're staying. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it like one. Yates was on his bunk with a water bottle, staring at the ceiling. He spoke without looking over. For what it's worth, he said, I learned more this week watching you work than I've learned in the last 3 months of regular training. Don't get sentimental, she said. I'm not sentimental. I'm accurate. She sat down on her bunk and started breaking down her rifle for the final time. Around her, the barracks were just barracks, concrete and metal bunks, and the smell of 12 days of field work, and nothing about them was comfortable, and she was very tired, and she felt, underneath the tired, something solid and familiar for a long time that her mother had first named for her when she was 16. She didn't have a word for it that was better than just. She was here. She had stayed. Whatever they threw at her, she had paid for her place and would keep paying. Because that was what you did when the thing you were fighting for was real. In the morning, there would be stand down. There would be reports filed and evaluations submitted and documentation that would outlast all of them. There would be conversations in offices she'd never be in, decisions made in rooms she'd never enter, about what the data from this exercise meant for people who hadn't been born yet. She finished the rifle, ran the bolt, set aside. Outside somewhere it had started raining. The particular Louisiana rain that came in from the Gulf without announcement and made everything smell like the earth had been turned over. She could hear it on the roof, steady and indifferent, the way weather was always indifferent to anything that happened underneath it. Kane lay down on her bunk and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 12 days, she slept without listening for footsteps.